So to give you an idea of Real Story Group, we are a market research firm, an analyst company, essentially, and we produce research that evaluates products. So it's a very similar model to Consumer Reports. So if you're familiar with Consumer Reports, they test things like washing machines and cars and compare them to one another, and based on your budget and what you're going to use that car for or that washing machine for, they tell you which one to buy. That's what we do, essentially, but we do it with very expensive enterprise technology products. Specifically, I cover digital asset management and media asset management for the firm. So OVP is really just a small little piece of the larger enterprise ecosystem that we cover in terms of information management. And wonderful guy that I work with covers OVP specifically. So anything I can't answer, I'll write it down and I'll take it back to him and I'll get back to you. So thanks for joining me today, as I mentioned. This is a particular interesting topic for me. I've worked in IT in general about 18 years, but I'm actually quite new to this space because I work with corporate marketing departments mostly on collateral image management, and I would say in the last 2 years, every marketing manager and every CMO that I work with has said, we need to start doing video. We're not a broadcaster, and we need to start doing video. So that's more the side that I'm coming from versus the broadcaster side, although I do work with some broadcasters. Mostly I'm working with companies that need to understand and get their feet wet with video. So some of you that are interested in sort of the enterprise YouTube versus something else, I'm seeing a lot of companies ask that question. So that's a little bit about Real Story Group and myself. And I'll get right in if you want to tweet. There's my handle right there. So, OK. So I mentioned already what we do. Research, analyzing strengths and weaknesses of technology. Usually we actually say weaknesses first because we are strictly buyers advocates, buyer side. So we don't work with, do deals with, negotiate with vendors. We strictly are there for buyers. Make sure you don't buy the wrong thing. That's why we exist. And we help people pick products. So usually I'm very rarely talking about an OVP by itself. Oftentimes it's a discussion about, OK, so today I was actually having lunch with a large broadcaster who said, well, we have something that's custom built for our high resolution video management. We need something to manage all of our images, and we need to stream video, and can we do all that with one solution? And the answer was no, but that tends to be the larger discussion. So OVP tends to be, like I said, a very small part of it. We have customers in about 60 countries, and I already talked about the last part. We published something that is very washed out on this screen. Unfortunately, we published basically a vendor guide that's in the form of a tube map, or a subway map, as you might say here. It's modeled after the London Tube, which is why it looks the way it does. But we evaluate about 250 different technology products. As I mentioned, OVPs, just a few that fit into this bigger picture. And unfortunately, I'm sorry it's so washed out on the screen, but what we do with the different technology markets is we plot them on a subway map to explain exactly what they do. So, for instance, media management vendors or web content management vendors, document management vendors, they all fall into these different sorts of categories. There tends to be these big hub vendors in the middle that many of you have probably heard of. I'll use Limelight as an example because they're here. Limelight's an example of a company that does many different things with video, but they also own a web content management system. So they fall into one of these sort of big hub stations like Google. They sell a lot of different types of technology to manage information. So I know it's hard to see this, but Real Story Group /vendor map, and you can pick one up yourself. And it'll give you an idea of just how many technology solutions are out there in the market. It's vast. And they all have generally very aggressive salespeople who will tell you their solutions can do anything. So I caution you to make sure you understand what you're buying. That's really the first lesson learned that I hope you'll take away today. So I think you all know about the importance of online video, but many of the people that we work with and many of the organizations we work with are struggling to justify investing in an OVP or moving beyond the YouTube channel, right? So your financial guy might say, well, isn't this good enough? And you say, well, we'd like to have some more money to do a little bit more with this technology. And it's tough to justify that necessarily. So I just pulled a few things from some just business case items, if anybody's looking for those, if you're trying to justify sort of looking at OVPs or taking the time to test them. So online purchases, if anyone's in retail, this is a really good really good stat from Internet Retailer where if somebody watches a video product or a video demonstration of a product, they're 85% more likely to buy something, right? So that's a good driver for this sort of technology. Video ads, fastest growing category of online advertising. Last year, video, of course, growing per Cisco, 66% of mobile data traffic. And Xbox users, we were talking about Xbox this morning in the keynote, spend more time watching video than playing games, which is also very interesting. So if you're looking for sort of statistics that you need, there's a lot out there that you can use to help justify this. Now, choosing a technology to support end-to-end video is a challenge. And generally, you're not going to pick just one thing. Especially if you're a broadcaster. How many of you here are sort of from a traditional broadcaster sort of world? OK, so a lot of you, as I would expect. This is just one piece of your puzzle, and that hopefully will become clearer as we go through this. Generally, when companies start with kind of getting their feet wet with the YouTube channel, with Vimeo, or even if they invest a little bit and do Vimeo Pro, they start to outgrow it pretty quickly if you get really serious about video. And I'll go through the criteria where you can say, oh, if this starts happening, I need to move on. So these platforms are proliferating. They're attractive alternatives. A lot of them are not all that expensive, so that's good. But they vary wildly in terms of maturity and functional capabilities. Now, I noticed that the ones that have very broad functional capabilities, and I'll talk about what those are in a second, they don't even like to be called OVPs. So I was actually talking this morning with the CEO of Kumu. Everyone familiar with Kumu? Anyone? A few people? OK, great. And they don't like being called an OVP because it's too limiting, right? And I can see that because many of them are adding broader, almost editing capabilities, lightweight video editing that maybe for somebody who doesn't have a full Avid suite or whatever they're using to create and edit video, they can do something quickly and cheaply with one of these. So we'll talk about that. So to define what a OVP does, this is right from Streaming Media, so thanks to Dan and his crew. A free or a fee-based service, so there are both, that does hosting, encoding, gives you the ability to customize or embed some kind of skinnable player. Usually you can make them look however you want so that they look like they belong to you rather than someone else. And it also gives you metrics for who's watching and how often that you wish to upload and distribute your own video content. That's the definition. Okay. So some typical OVP functions. One thing that's key about OVPs is that they're mostly SaaS, but some of them, especially the ones that cater to the bigger broadcasters or that have lots and lots of very long form video, they will generally do it internally rather than on the SaaS side. But the less expensive sort of corporate oriented OVPs tend to be SaaS, and they tend to be subscription based for a few $100 to $1,000 a month. So this is what these tools do to varying degrees. Pretty much the lion's share of these tools do different levels of these different functions. And as I often say, if you categorize a whole bunch of vendors and you say this is the OVP market, they generally all do the same thing. So that's something people often want to say, well, what's different about these? And the reality is it's not what they do, it's how they do it. Okay? And it's also what they favor in terms of partnerships, in terms of distribution channels, and in terms of how advanced they are in, say, device targeting, in terms of formats and things like that. So if you go with an OVP, you're going to get these sorts of things. It's just a matter of how advanced is that functionality and how exactly does that get realized. An important distinction, because often these markets get blurred, is the difference between EVPs and OVPs. So there are some vendors that do both of these, but in general, vendors will focus on one or the other. So an enterprise video platform is really geared towards internal communications. Very different from the external side. So I will start to refer to these as use case scenarios. Is anyone familiar with the use case scenario for? OK, great. I'm sure some of you are. So one of the things that we advocate when you're selecting an OVP or any technology, it doesn't matter if you're out to select web content management system, image management, whatever you need to do, you should understand what are your use cases. Don't make a long list of requirements. It's like saying, I'm going to buy a car and I want it to have a steering wheel and I want it to have 4 wheels and a cup holder. Well, yeah, that's what cars have. You need to actually understand, am I driving this in Manhattan and I want a smart car because I can park it in small places, or I'm going to take it to Sicily and I'm going to drive it up and down the mountains and I want a Ferrari because I want to look cool. It's very different use case scenarios, right? You need to think the same way when you're buying technology. It's just like that. You don't need a Ferrari to drive up the street to get milk. So you don't want to buy an online video platform that's geared towards external use cases to do your internal video conferencing, for example. So these use cases on the enterprise EVP side include, you got video conferencing, okay? That's very often on a global scale with big screens where you're sitting around a table and you're sort of setting up a virtual environment. Executive communication and the idea of town halls. So just like if you were all in a different place and I was talking into the camera, you could watch me streaming, for example, and have this interaction. Lectures and training, or sometimes e-learning can fit into that. Web conferencing, and live events. The more online OVP use cases is around things like advertising and branding. It's around things like content marketing, the e-commerce side, and user-generated or social media sorts of content. So again, the vendors go into different areas, and don't worry, we'll categorize the vendors into these use cases so you can understand who does what a little bit better. Okay. Here's sort of breaking down the core functions. So in the definition on streaming media, I talked about sort of creation. That's often called ingestion in this world of OVPs, or it's called that in digital asset management as well. Usually you say ingestion because oftentimes the video is created before it ever hits the system, right? So sometimes the system ingests it. The question is, how is that happening? Is it happening in real time as the video is being streamed? Is it happening in bulk? Is it happening one by one? Is it only happening to a certain kind of format and it chokes at some other format? So understanding, again, all these systems take stuff in one way or another. The question is, how do you need to take it in? What formats? How much? What quantity? What format? All that kind of stuff. Do you need to take in user-generated sorts of video if you're in that sort of business? Then there's the management side. So this is, once the video is in the platform, can you edit it? In some cases, you can do very sort of lightweight editing. So that way, if you need to take a clip or you want to take a still, you don't have to necessarily go and find the version in your interplay system or whatever production studio you're using. Could you send it through a simple workflow, metadata around it, searchability, analytics, and integrations? And that's a key differentiator right there, is integrations. So depending on what you need to integrate with, different vendors favor different sorts of partners, different sorts of web content management systems, for example, different sorts of content delivery networks, different sorts of development platforms, whatever it might be. That's key. And that's what you should understand. Don't just put on a requirements form, I need it to integrate. OK, great. Of course, everyone needs it to integrate. So describe how in great detail. And then finally, with the delivery side, multi-platform. So that has a lot to do with device detection. This person is using this kind of device, so I need to give them this kind of format of the video. The skinnable player, what do you want it to look like? What's your level of flexibility in terms of how it will look? Caching, CDN, I already alluded to that. And then rights and security. Rights and security is often the trigger for people to move beyond sort of the YouTube approach to video and going with something a little more advanced. Here is an illustration. Oops, that doesn't work. That's kind of odd. OK. Let's see if I can go back and then go forward. Ah, there it was. For some reason, it went black on me. But that's the illustration that I was hoping would come up. So this is an example from Sonic Foundry, just showing what the capture, create, import, which is different flavors of getting stuff into the system, depending on how you do it. And then the management that happens inside, and then the delivery, multiple devices, or maybe you're pushing it to a content management system or a learning management system or some kind of portal. or maybe you're pushing it to your friendly neighborhood CDN, as an example. Or a combination of all those, right? Oftentimes you are pushing something, a slightly different flavor of whatever the master version is based on the output, based on the channel. Let's see, okay, that worked that time. Here's another example of core functionality illustration from screen 9. And you can see you've got the player option, mobile option, pushing to the CDN. You've got API that facilitates integration, syndication, et cetera. So it's just different visualizations of the functionality. Before I get into specific vendors, we'll show an architecture illustration for the techies in the room. This is often usually how the technology fits together. So you've got core functionality. So I went through pretty much all those already in terms of what's the base platform and what you're getting out of that. And then there's different forms of publishing. And a lot of times now, specifically, there's very specific mobile tools for mobile distribution. There tends to be separate software development kits for different mobile OSs. And to varying degrees, some vendors are more focused on certain mobile platforms than others. So that just gives you an idea of how that fits together. OK. So here is a little bit on the internal use cases. So when I talked about the EVPs, right? So going back to that slide before. OK. So as I mentioned, vendors tend to focus on one or the other, the internal side or the external side. And I have except Kaltura because they tend to do both, really. They'll span both sides. So vendors will typically offer both hardware and software, or if they don't, they will provide integration mechanisms with third-party hardware, and they will have specific partnerships with those third parties. So from this standpoint, you've got the hardware and software vendors, and then the software-centric ones. So even among the ones that are internally focused, very few of them will cover all the different aspects that I listed. In terms of, for instance, doing town halls versus e-learning, in terms of integrating with the output systems that might be supporting that or that might be tracking that. So, but those are the vendors that really focus there. And interestingly, it was funny when I was being interviewed before this session, and the interviewer was trying to get me to specifically name ones that I thought were better than others or the best, and I really don't like to do that, and I'm sure many of you probably might want to know, okay, well, which one's the best? I think the reality is that it varies vastly based on what you need to do in terms of what's most appropriate. And even the vendors that don't necessarily have as much functionality yet, some of them tend to be moving more quickly and tend to be moving more agile and being a little more cutting edge. So if you ask me that question, I will end up asking you questions about what's precisely you need, because it really does vary. I don't believe that you can say there's a best vendor, just like you can't necessarily say there's a best car, because it really depends who you are, what your budget is, and what your use case is. But this at least gives you an idea of who's focused on external use cases, who does both the hardware and software, and then the pure software players. Okay, here's the ones that are more focused on the external use cases. So customers tend to go in this direction because their needs become too complex. And I'll list some more criteria around that a little bit later. Also, to get the customer service and support that you're not going to necessarily get from having a YouTube channel, right? If something goes down, if they're having a problem, they want to be able to call. They want to be able to call the video their own more. A lot of it is an ownership thing. A lot of it is a security thing. And the reality is you can get OVPs from some of these vendors for just a few $100s a month. So it's not generally that hard to justify this. It's very different from certain enterprise systems that cost $500,000, for example. So these are generally more end-to-end than the EVPs. So when I said the enterprise video platforms, they'll tend to focus on one area, like town halls or town meetings, whatever they might focus on, or e-learning. These guys tend to cover more of the different scenarios on that that divided slide where I showed the different use cases. So that can be helpful. So if you do go in one of these directions, you should be able to satisfy a lot of those use cases. Integration is a key differentiator. So I alluded to that earlier. These are usually the key integration points that people ask about. So depending on your needs, you'll need to describe very specifically, if you have a web content management system, how you need to integrate with it. If you have a digital asset management system, how do you need to integrate with it? Web analytics. If you're going to be looking at, for example, how many people have watched a particular video that you have on your website, where and how is that analytics going to happen? You know, some OVPs will give you some level of analytics, but oftentimes the web content management system will give you a form of analytics, and maybe you're running a whole separate analytics tool, like Google Analytics. So figuring out which system is actually going to do that. Or are you going to just let your web analytics tool do it and not this tool? Your CDN, I mentioned that. Digital rights management, if that's important, if there's certain people that should be able to see a video versus not, you'll need to describe how that should work. And then, of course, encoding services. So let's then get into a little bit about how these compare a little bit more specifically. So when you're actually selecting a vendor, as I mentioned, it's not about who the best vendor is. You know, my team and I we're crusading small analyst firm, specifically because we don't believe in best vendors. We don't believe in putting somebody in the top right of a quadrant. We believe that there is a fit for everybody, right? And it's going to be different based on who you are and what matters. So I talked about scenarios already. When you are thinking about picking your OVP, write some of these scenarios. Describe, here's our end-to-end video process. It gets created in this kind of system, or this specific system, by these people, right? And then it has to go through this kind of workflow, describe that workflow. And then it's going to get put in this OVP, and it has to go to these kinds of channels in these kinds of formats, to these sorts of customers, and describe the security model around that. Because that will help hone you in. Okay? So that's the scenarios. You need to think about what those scenarios are. The technology fit. So this is where you say specifically, here's the kinds of systems I need to integrate with, and here's what they are. Name them. So if you're using Sitecore for web content management, and you already have a relationship with Brightcove, and you already have a big Avid Interplay production system, make sure that you make that clear. Because these different vendors have tight relationships with very specific partners. That's going to make it easier or harder for you to get this together. Partner fit, that's really alluding to who's going to actually set it up for you and who's going to do the work for you. This is a little bit easier on the OVP side because so many of them are SaaS, but there still will be work to get the critical mass into the system. And then finally, value. Again, these are all relatively inexpensive systems compared to the larger, media management systems, et cetera. But you want to make sure, am I actually getting the value that I'm paying for? One of the biggest problems that we see in general with buyers of enterprise technology is that they spend too much. They overbuy because they think they need to buy the biggest and greatest and best thing. But oftentimes there's a solution that's more moderately priced or even less expensive that will fit your needs. So think about that. So here's the use case scenarios that you need to think about yourselves potentially fitting into. And so the upper part is the EVP, the enterprise video platform, and the bottom part is the more OVP side. So are you going to be doing marketing? Are you going to be doing monetization with advertising, for example? Do you have social media needs? Are you going to be taking in user-generated content, all that sort of stuff? And these are just this is how we do ratings in our particular research. So where it's basically a 5-point scale, where empty circle means not very good, and half circle means okay, and full circle means they do a really good job. So to give you an example, I brought up Cultura because they do stretch across all these use cases, whereas others focus very specifically on one or two or something else. Make sense? Yes. Okay. Question.
Do you rate by learning curve?
We rate by learning curve. We don't rate by learning curve, but if we have talked to a critical mass of customers who say that something was really difficult to set up, we will say that very specifically. But we don't rate that. We don't rate that numerically. Let's put it that way. But we'll mention it. And again, OVPs are. It's interesting because to us, because we look at much more complex systems, these are actually relatively straightforward compared to, say, the Delettes of the world or the VizRTs of the world that broadcasters are using to do media management and archiving. So I don't consider these as complex, but if we have enough people telling us that they were difficult, we say it. So. Anything else while we're still going here? So okay, great. Some other things that you want to think about while we're talking about them. How do you want the system? Do you want it hosted, or do you want it on-premise, or do you want some kind of hybrid? So a lot of times with OVPs, people want something that's on-premise for whatever reason, security often, or just because it has to be very deeply integrated with some other internal systems. So think about, do you want a mix of that, or one or the other? The licensing model. So some of these will charge a flat fee. In some cases, there's some that charge by volume in one way or another. So think about what's the most reasonable for you. What kind of hardware do you need? Obviously, very important. The integration features, I mentioned that already. User engagement and interactivity. This is a big growing area of functionality for these systems. Okay, so how much can I actually go in, not just the end user, but also if I'm an internal behind the firewall user, what can I actually do when I get in there? If I need to take a clip, if I need to take a still or something, things that a lot of people want to do without having to have some big video editing suite. That's a big growing area for these systems. So understand if you need to do that. The level of sophistication of the analytics is also a big topic of conversation right now. What do you need to know about these videos? Is it just how many people watched it, where they were located, or is it who actually clicked on the ad that was showing before the video or during the video and actually ended up helping you monetize it? So there's details there that are important. And of course, mobile support. Again, don't just say you need mobile support. Describe what kind of mobile support you need, how you want it to work. Some of the examples this morning during the keynote were really interesting because it showed a very varied sort of model where if it's app specific, that's different from streaming through a browser. If you have your own specific mobile app that you want people to be able to use that might integrate with this, you need to describe that very specifically. Okay. Okay. So a few more details. Here's the next level of description that you want to get into. So when you're writing your use cases, as I mentioned, don't just do a list of requirements. Describe these things. Okay. And there's actually more exhaustive lists out there about this. And actually, streamingmedia.com is a great source for, I think they actually publish an OVP selection checklist that's more extensive than this list. But this is at least a start for you. So when you walk out of here, you can start thinking what you want to be able to do. So in terms of ingestion, as I mentioned, every one of these systems ingests. But some of them, for example, don't necessarily allow you to do it from a mobile device. They might stream out to mobile devices, but if you have a lot of people in the field, or if you're collecting user-generated content and people are filming things on mobile devices, they don't necessarily take in, they'll only go out to mobile devices. Compressing files, for example, on the way in. Do you want to be able to do that? Some systems will just say, we'll only take it as it is. And I think I don't need to read through them all, but if anybody has specific questions about any of these features, feel free to ask. The biggest topics of conversation that I'm hearing right now with our customers are around the security, encryption, those pieces increasingly for subscription-based broadcast sorts of scenarios where they need to do specific things, and the mobile piece. because the others are more commoditized. So being able to have drop folders where you put stuff in there and it goes into the system, that's pretty commoditized. But again, the functionality is getting broader and broader. So think about that. And you might actually have some of these features with another enterprise system that's not an OVP, and that's another thing you need to consider. You might, for example, be creating, let's see, you might be doing your content syndication with something else. You might be doing acceleration, for example. You might be doing that with something else. So know what else you have already before you pay for these features. One of the things I always recommend when you're doing a selection process is to not only write your use case scenarios as you're doing it now, but how you'd like it to work. That's really the key. So think about that, and don't do, I already said this, but there's my official graphic. Don't write a list of long requirements. OVPs, they do what I described in the earlier slide. They generally all do the same thing. Describe how you want it to work and write through a scenario. Describe the story. Imagine you're telling someone a story. I often say it's like you're describing it to a kid. Tell the story, make it simple, and then you'll be able to compare apples to apples a lot better. A lot of times people will bring vendors in. What I recommend is don't just bring vendors in to do a demo for you. Write your scenarios first, send them your scenarios, and then say, show us how you do it. And that way you can actually compare apples to apples. Because generic demos are really generally very useless to you because they're not going to be your content. They're not actually going to show you what it would be like for you or your users to do what they need to do. So if you write these descriptive scenarios and say, based on your requirements, based on your scenarios, you can narrow it down. For example, that you want a public-facing OVP, and I'm going to take these 4 or 5 vendors, send them your scenarios, and say, OK, we're thinking about working with you, or just test based on the scenario. So even if you don't bring in sales representatives, most of these vendors, they offer a free 30-day trial. So don't just decide which one you're going to buy without doing that. You can actually take your own descriptive scenarios, take your own videos, and test with your own content. So I'm going to use the car scenario one more time. Almost all of us, we drive a test drive. We take the test drive before we buy the car. And I'm always amazed at how people select software without ever testing it. Not just OVPs, but $500,000 media management systems or $500,000 DAM systems, and they never test it. There is nothing preventing you from testing it. Either use a 30-day trial or talk to a sales guy and say, we're going to test it. And if they say no, don't work with them. Period, end of story. So make sure you go in and you do that. And be sure to ask the tough questions, pricing, etc. Has anyone gone through this sort of scenario-based, right? We got some nods, sort of, OK. A lot of times I hear organizations say, well, this takes too much time. We're just going to pick based on some online chart and go that direction. But the reality is this is worth your time. It's worth your time to actually test it because you're going to make a better choice if you do that. So that's it. So that's the core part of the presentation. I know a lot of you had specific questions about specific OVPs. So I thought I'll go back here to these slides where where I listed and talked about the vendors and just elaborate on that a little more. And then I'm happy to take questions with about the 5 minutes we have left. So as I mentioned, these are the ones that are focused on the EVP. So if you're looking to do more of this internal video management, these are generally the guys to look at. This could be even considered a short list. Write your own use cases. And these will stretch across pretty much the 3 or 4 that I listed. Although some are more focused on others, like Cisco and Polycom, for example, are very focused on the internal teleconferencing and communication, whereas the others are more focused in the, I'll just bring this one back up so you have an idea again, where some of the other vendors are more focused on the live events, etc. Whereas the other ones that I list on the subsequent slide are focused in these areas, and some are slightly stronger on the content marketing, advertising, branding side, where others are more focused on e-commerce. And I could speak to that Specifically, Uyala, for example, has a lot of, is sort of a darling of the e-commerce space and the media space as well, especially with media and entertainment. If you're in there, you'd want to look that direction. And that's the general overview. Questions? Anything else? I know I talked very fast. Yes? What's their need? I would say they're very broad. I wouldn't even say that I wouldn't even put them in a niche. I mean, they're very, very broad, and they're not really vertical specific. They stretch across a whole bunch of different industries and verticals. So they're one of the most general of these vendors. So, yeah. Is there a report that you guys did of all? We have a media asset management research stream that covers a whole bunch of vendors much broader than this. And we have a specific paper on selecting an OVP and considerations. It also covers CDNs. So that's our specific research report on the topic. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, in terms of integrations on the enterprise video platform side,
yep.
Which would you say are the top 3 most important integrations?
Oh, the top 3 most important integrations. I thought you were going to ask me which ones are the best to integrate, and I was going to say it depends what you're integrating with. The top ones to integrate. Well, I think that it's changed very recently because almost everybody who's adopted an OVP historically has already integrated with their websites, their web portals. Today it's more about apps. And even though you're developing an app and you somehow have to make it work with that app in a specific way. So that's more common today because there's like the ESPN app this morning where it was very specific. The CDN, obviously integrating with the OVP to CDN is very, very important. What would I say is the third? I would probably say if you're a broadcaster.
No, so just to clarify.
Yep.
Enterprise video platform.
Okay. Oh, so these guys. Yes. This space I don't know as well, I admit. I might have to ask my our analyst who covers this. A lot of times it's a video archive where if you're for example, someone I was talking to this morning about this, if you're a financial firm and you're recording your internal calls, for example, usually there's some kind of technology that's a searchable, very metadata-rich archive, so that if you have to find all the conversations you ever had about this company that this mutual fund invested in, you need to be able to do that. So often it's a metadata-rich, searchable archive around whatever the topics of conversation were in these different things. That's the first one that comes to mind.
So like SharePoint or something?
Well, SharePoint is a whole other can of worms that we could open. I don't see as much SharePoint integration with these guys as I do in other corporate environments because you're not really, SharePoint is so document focused and it's so Microsoft document focused and it's so oriented in a specific world of its own. You could definitely take whatever you're generating in terms of video and transcribe it, and SharePoint is so video unfriendly that I don't see that much. Is anybody doing that? Is anyone integrating SharePoint? Do they? Okay. Yeah. A lot more, yes. But historically, I haven't seen people doing much of it yet. Let's put it that way. I'm sure it's going to increase, but it's generally been so SharePoint. Yeah. Well, yeah. It's finally got rid of Silverlight and all that. But yes. Yeah. Yeah. Is that what you were alluding to?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or like a learning management system.
Yep. 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 Yeah, that's a great example. Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
What do you see happening in the industry over the next 12 to 24 months in terms of more or fewer OVPs, more consolidation, particularly on the entertainment?
Yeah. Well, there's about 90 right now. We focus on about 15 that we cover just because our customers are mostly big companies. So I think that many of them will be acquired, especially by big players like Oracle or open text, whoever you want to allude to. But for every one that's acquired, there'll be a new one. And I think that those new ones will not be so OVP specific. I think OVPs, I think they'll be more like the Kumus of the world that have OVP as one feature, but maybe they're also providing a CDN rather than partnering with somebody else, and they're going to stretch. I think they're going to stretch their functionality. So it's you'll probably end up with about the same amount or same number over time, but they'll be broader in terms of functionality, and some of them will end up getting bought. No, not right now. I think some of the ones that are newish have struggled. Many of them are being sustained by investor money rather than customers. So we'll see how that pans out. Yes, back there.
You mentioned that e-learning you'd put more with EVP, but e-commerce
Yep.
you would put more with OVP.
Yeah.
If you were to advise Lynda.com when they were startups, which direction would you point them? Someone who wanted to sell their e-learning content.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, I probably would have put them more in the consumer side. Yeah, I would have probably put them in the later direction.
That are hybrid, would that be preferable?
Yes, there are, and in that case, you might even look at a specific. I mean, there's obviously specific e-learning platforms that have OVP features, and that's a market that we don't cover in depth. But I know, there's several dozen vendors that specifically offer a lot of what these guys offer, but very geared around measuring how far through this course has this person gone, how far. So it's more in this direction, but there's a whole separate market for it.
It's a different set.
It's a different set. Correct. Yeah. But if it had to be one of these two columns, I would say this one. So, 1 second. Someone back there. Yep. Go ahead.
Yeah, Teresa, I'm
Yep.
founder of an OVP called Op-Ed.
Great.
You did an excellent job, I think, with your overview of the technology.
Thanks.
And I just want to offer and underscore a point.
Sure. Please.
When you're in the position of shopping around, you don't need to understand the entire ecosystem. You don't even need to understand the full platform technology. But what I want to underscore that you had said was you need to understand your business model. Where you're trying to get with digital delivery. So the more you can tell that story, as you're saying, Teresa, I think the easier path you'll find to getting with the right partner. And I think Uyala and Brightcove and Kaltura have got a lot to offer for very, very big companies. A lot of smaller OVPs have caught up with the technology.
Yeah.
And because we're smaller, we're very agile, we can adapt more easily, and we partner really well with customers as well. And I'm happy to answer questions you have.
I admit my inherent bias towards larger ones because most of our research subscribers are Fortune 1000, so we tend to favor the ones that are big. But thank you for mentioning that for the smaller companies in the room. I can take. There was one more question right here, and then I think we have to wrap up.
Before the
Yes.
EVP.
Yep. Right
If
here.
town hall meetings and
Yeah.
lectures are my primary use case,
Mm-hmm.
where should I?
Well, town hall lectures. Really, they all do one form of that or another. Depends on the scale. Is it global? Is it global scale? You might want to go some of the ones that do both the hardware and software side. But really, the list is short enough, depending on how big you are as a company, that you could test 3 or 4. But I would definitely at least look at Polycom in your scenario. We're out of time. If anybody has more questions, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it, and I'm happy to send you the slides if you leave me a card. Thanks so much.